Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a radically objective look at the mechanics behind two major, highly emotional news stories dominating the headlines right now. As always, our goal is to just strip away all the noise and understand exactly how these situations are actually unfolding, on the ground, in the courts, and across the globe.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our agenda for today. First, the UK sentencing outcry. Then, youth justice explained. Next, the Court of Appeal. After that, US strikes in Iran. And finally, the geopolitical chessboard.
Section 1. The UK sentencing outcry. The public reaction to a controversial non-custodial sentence.
Look, this is a story that has sparked widespread public astonishment, and frankly, a lot of anger, across the United Kingdom. Recently, 3 teenage boys, all under the age of 16, were handed youth rehabilitation orders. That basically means they avoid custody and remain in the community. And this was after being convicted of the planned, horrific rape of 2 girls. Now, the public outcry over this non-custodial outcome was so intense that it reached the absolute highest levels of government. Prime Minister Keir Starmer actually came out and publicly addressed the situation. He called the case distressing for everybody. But more importantly, from a legal mechanics standpoint, he confirmed that the Attorney General is stepping in to review the sentence.
Now, what's really interesting here is the contrast. It's just staggering. During sentencing, the Crown Prosecution Service argued that this was a crime of the highest harm, Category 1 harm, involving significant planning. If these offenders were adults, prosecutors noted the appropriate sentence would fall somewhere between 12 and 19 years in prison. Yet, because they are youths, the outcome was non-custodial community rehabilitation. So, how does a gap like that even happen?
Section 2. Youth Justice Explained. How the legal system treats the developing brain.
Okay, to really understand this outcome, we have to look past the raw emotion of the crime for a second and examine the actual legal framework governing how judges sentence minors. In the youth justice system, judges are strictly mandated to weigh several specific factors. You see, the whole system operates on the premise that teenage brains aren't fully formed yet, meaning the prospects for rapid change and rehabilitation are actually quite significant. They also have to look at individual capacity. For instance, it was noted in court that one of these offenders had an IQ in the lowest 1% of the population. And there is precedent for this rehabilitation-first approach working. Take the case of boy S. He was a 14-year-old terrorism offender who, instead of being locked away for life, was given a sentence that allowed him to rehabilitate and successfully re-enter society in his early 20s. The ultimate question the system asks is custody truly necessary?
Now, because these boys avoided youth custody, the law preserves their anonymity. We don't know who they are. But this brings up a massive, foundational question in the justice system. When does a child actually become criminally responsible? In England and Wales, that age is set at just 10 years old. And when you put that into perspective with its European neighbors, the UK is a huge outlier. At just 10 years old, the UK's age of criminal responsibility, which was actually set years ago by Tony Blair's government, is noticeably lower than France at 13, Germany at 14, and Scotland at 12. Raising this age to match those European comparators, well, that is currently a highly complex and deeply sensitive political debate happening right now within the ruling Labour Party.
Section 3. The Court of Appeal. Fast-tracking justice and the review process.
So what happens next? The Crown Prosecution Service took a really unusual step here. They actively questioned the judge's decision. And doing that triggers a mechanism called the Unduly Lenient Sentence, or ULS scheme. It's basically a way for sentences deemed unreasonably low to be challenged. The Attorney General, who acts as the government's top legal advisor, is using this exact mechanism right now to push this case up the ladder.
Let's walk through the actual behind-the-scenes mechanics of how this fast-tracked appeal will work. Step 1. The Attorney General consults with top prosecutors to confirm that, yes, the sentence is an outlier. Step 2. 3 highly experienced Court of Appeal judges are appointed to the case. And Step 3. They hold a fast-tracked half-day hearing. They'll read the arguments, review similar case law, and make a really swift ruling. If they decide that youth custody in a secure children's home is actually required, the voice sentences will change. And crucially, at that point, media applications to lift that anonymity might actually be considered.
Let's move on and see how this builds in Section 4, U.S. strikes in Iran. Ceasefires, bluster, and overnight airstrikes.
All right, hard pivot to the Middle East. We are currently in a very, very fragile holding pattern, punctuated by sudden overnight airstrikes. And the narratives coming from both sides right now? completely opposed. On one hand, U.S. CENTCOM insists these were strictly self-defense strikes. They say they hit missile sites and mine-laying boats to protect troops, and that it's absolutely not a restart of a broader campaign. Meanwhile, the Iranian regime forcefully claims these are ceasefire violations by the U.S., going so far as to assert that they even successfully downed an American MQ-9 drone.
To really understand Iran's geopolitical playbook here, we need to talk about a crucial concept: triangular coercion. Because Iran knows they cannot match the U.S. militarily in a direct head-to-head fight, they apply intense pressure on smaller, U.S.-allied Gulf nations instead. The goal? To threaten global oil and gas exports so severely that it indirectly forces the U.S. to back down. This perfectly frames a recent, highly defiant message from Iran's supreme leader, who bluntly stated that regional countries will no longer act as a shield for American bases. Section 5. The Geopolitical Chessboard. Negotiating peace in a volatile region. So while the military strikes are happening overnight, you've got this incredibly complex diplomatic maneuvering happening simultaneously during the day at the Doha talks. And the web of regional interests is just completely tangled. You have Donald Trump pushing for a massive historic expansion of the Abraham Accords, but then Arab nations are super hesitant because they deeply fear Iranian retaliation. And Iran? Well, they explicitly reject any deal involving Israel. In fact, the supreme leader recently repeated claims that Israel will literally be destroyed within 15 to 25 years. So finding any sort of broad consensus here is incredibly difficult.
So the crucial point we really need to keep in mind is that hovering over all of these negotiations is a massive nuclear shadow. Get this, Iran currently holds over 400 kilograms of nuclear material enriched to 60% purity. That is staggering. Any long-term negotiation absolutely has to address this. Interestingly, there's been talk from Donald Trump about potentially transferring this material to a third country that actually has the infrastructure to dismantle it. That suggests a potential pathway forward on this one specific critical issue.
But because of all those massive sticking points we just talked about, the immediate diplomatic priority is actually quite narrow. Negotiators are desperately trying to secure just a 30 to 60-day extension of the ceasefire. Why so short? Simply to reopen the Strait of Hormuz so that global oil and fertilizer exports can just start flowing again, relieving the mounting pressure on the global economy.
And of course, complicating matters even further is the complete failure of the parallel ceasefire in Lebanon. Israeli strikes on Hezbollah targets are ongoing, civilian casualties are mounting, and Hezbollah is completely excluded from the talks happening in D.C. right now. It seems like there's a tacit agreement right now between the U.S. and Iran to just keep the Lebanon crisis in a separate lane so it doesn't entirely derail the talks regarding the Strait of Hormuz. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. With Donald Trump heavily pushing to link his signature Abraham Accords to Iranian diplomacy, we have to ask, will the pursuit of a massive, historic regional peace deal actually sabotage the desperate need for a narrow, immediate ceasefire? In trying to solve the whole puzzle all at once, do these leaders risk losing the only achievable step forward? It's a hugely precarious balancing act for global security, and for sure, it's one we will be watching very closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the headlines.